This is part 2 of our lecture on the vestibular and visual systems. Our final lecture of Unit 3 will focus on the visual system. We talked about this system fairly extensively when discussing cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve. We're going to add to that a little bit now and go further into what happens beyond the primary visual cortex. There are 3 primary pathways for the visual information that I would like you to know. One is known as the ventral visual stream, or the perception stream. This is also known as the who-what pathway. Information going to the primary visual cortex then goes to the secondary visual cortex, an area surrounding the primary visual cortex that gives us general interpretation of things such as movement, color, and general properties of what we're looking at. From there, the information goes to the inferotemporal cortex, where we have specific interpretation of the information. Here is where we identify who it is we are looking at, or what it is that we are looking at. The dorsal visual stream is known as the action stream, or the where-how pathway. Information from the primary visual cortex goes to the secondary visual cortex, again for that general interpretation. But from here, instead of going to the inferotemporal cortex, it goes to the posterior parietal cortex. This enables us to spatially localize. It gives us that ability, that depth perception, that ability to tell where things are relative to each other in space. It allows us to detect and analyze where things are located and to visually guide movement. Here is a link to an image showing the dorsal and ventral visual streams. And here is my image showing the 2 visual streams. We have the eye off to the left there. Information is coming in, going into the optic nerve, would go through the optic chiasm, into the optic tract, get to the LGN nucleus of the thalamus, the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, where it synapses on the second-order neuron. Second-order neurons travel in the optic radiations, superior and inferior optic radiations, to get back to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. Information there then goes to the secondary visual cortex, which gives us general interpretation of that information, color and movement. This is an area where frequently the neurons involved with color distinction in men, more so than women, may not function normally. This is a genetic basis, and that can be color blindness. And color blindness is more common in men. The next set of neurons from the secondary visual cortex then takes that information through the ventral visual stream or the dorsal visual stream. The ventral visual stream takes us to the inferotemporal cortex, so the inferior aspect of the temporal lobe. And this is where we identify who we are looking at or what we are looking at. The dorsal stream takes us to the posterior aspect of the parietal cortex, where we understand where things are located, where things are relative to each other, as well as how to use these things. The third pathway I would like you to know is information that bypasses the thalamus and the primary visual cortex, but goes to the hypothalamus and the brainstem. While we get unconscious awareness of visual input at the level of the thalamus, we also have unconscious awareness of visual input at the hypothalamus and in the brainstem. It is the connections with the brainstem that helps with reflex responses, such as pulling your head away as an object is quickly approaching your face. This can be true even in somebody who has damage involving both primary visual cortices, blind sight, as I mentioned in the lecture on the optic nerve. The hypothalamus uses visual information to help with sleep cycles and circadian rhythm. It's very important for setting our body clock. Information going to the brainstem goes to the superior colliculus, where it's combined with input from the auditory system and helps control eye movements by sending output to cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, as well as head movements going to cranial nerve 11, the accessory nerve. And here is my drawing to kind of show where things are located here. So we have the visual input coming in. Most of it is going to go to the thalamus, and from the thalamus down over to the primary visual cortex and the occipital lobe. However, some of our visual information bypasses the thalamus and instead goes to the brainstem, to the superior colliculus. Looks like a fried egg in my particular picture. And then, in the brainstem, we have the cranial nerve 3 oculomotor nerve situated in the rostral midbrain, cranial nerve 4 trochlear nerve in the caudal midbrain, cranial nerve 6 abducens in the caudal pons, and cranial nerve 11 accessory in the upper cervical levels of the spinal cord. The oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens cranial nerves all control extraocular muscles of the eye, whereas accessory controls trapezius and sternocleidomastoid. Information then going to the superior colliculus has output from the superior colliculus then to these different nuclei in order to control activation of the muscles of the eye as well as the neck. So our cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 send outputs to the extraocular muscles, while cranial nerve 11 sends output to the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid. This helps us in coordinating head and eye movements. That information going from the superior colliculus to cranial nerve 11 is carried in the tectospinal tract. We talked about that tract in Unit 2 with our descending motor systems. There are different types of eye movements. Some are known as saccades, and some are known as smooth pursuits. Saccades are high-speed eye movements that happen when you move from one object to another. So if I quickly move from looking at one thing to another, maybe I'm talking to two different people, and I want to look at them as I'm talking to them, so my eyes will move from one to the other. Those would be saccades. Smooth pursuits are eye movements that occur when you're following a moving object. So if you are watching a car go by, as your eyes follow that car, that would be a smooth pursuit. So think of smooth pursuits as you are pursuing a moving object. And now some pathologies that you should know from our lecture on cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve. These are ones that I do want you to know. The two types of hemianopia, homonymous and bitemporal. Homonymous meaning that both eyes have lost the same half of the visual field. It is named for the visual field deficit. So a left homonymous hemianopia would indicate that I've lost the left visual field in both eyes, and it is due to damage to either the right optic tract, right thalamus, the LGN, the right optic radiations, both inferior and superior would have to be involved for this, or the right primary visual cortex, both upper and lower banks. Bitemporal hemianopia is where the two eyes have differing field loss. They've both lost the lateral or temporal visual field. So the right eye has lost its right visual field and the left eye has lost its left visual field. This occurs when there is damage to just the central part of the optic chiasm, taking out only the crossing visual field information. Quadratopia, losing 1/4 of our visual fields, which would be the same in both eyes. Could be a right superior, a left superior, a right inferior, or a left inferior homonymous quadratopia. A right superior would be associated with injury to either the left inferior optic radiation or the inferior bank of the calcium fissure on the left primary visual cortex, etc. So remember, we flipped upside down and flipped rights and lefts. Cortical blindness is when you have damage to both primary visual cortices in full, and though the person does not perceive visual input, they still have that unconscious awareness in the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the brainstem. And blind sight, because of that unconscious awareness of visual input, is the ability to adjust or have reflex responses to things related to that visual input, or in the case of unconsciously having a sense when something moves, knowing the direction of movement. And then ipsilateral blindness, which takes place when you have damage to either an eye itself, the retina or the cornea, or some other part of the eye, or the optic nerve going to that eye. Then there are some pathologies that you are not required to know, but I'm telling you just for your information. Motion sickness is really a conflict between sensory information. Your eyes are telling you one thing, but your vestibular system is telling you something different. The conflicts can lead to stimulation of the autonomic centers, resulting in a sense of nausea and vertigo.